I never believed in fate until I stood in that cemetery on a grey October morning and watched a man seal his own death warrant without knowing it. The funeral was for Thomas Brennan, a good man who'd worked 42 years at the steel mill before his heart gave out one Tuesday evening, while he was watching the news. He left behind a widow, Catherine, a woman of 73 with silver hair and tired eyes who'd loved him since they were both 17. The cemetery was old, the kind with moss-covered headstones dating back to the Civil War, towering oaks that cast long shadows across the graves, and that particular smell of damp earth and cut grass that always accompanies such occasions. About 50 people had gathered to pay their respects, family, friends, former co-workers, neighbours who'd known the Brennans for decades. It was a modest service, dignified and quiet, exactly what Thomas would have wanted. The priest had just finished his benediction, his words about eternal rest and reunion in heaven hanging in the cool autumn air. Catherine stood at the graveside, clutching a single rose she would place on the casket, her hand trembling slightly as she prepared to say her final goodbye to the man who'd been her whole world for 56 years. That's when Marcus Webb showed up, and the atmosphere changed immediately. He wasn't invited, that much was obvious from the way people stiffened when they saw him approaching. Marcus was known in the neighborhood, and not in any good way. He was the enforcer for a local loan shark, the kind of man who collected debts with threats and violence, who got off on intimidating people who couldn't fight back. At 38 years old, he'd built a reputation for cruelty that extended well beyond his professional obligations. He was a bully by nature and by choice, someone who'd found a career that rewarded his worst impulses. He stood about 6'4" with a muscular build that came from prison workouts and steroid abuse, his neck thick as a tree trunk, his hands scarred from years of beating people who couldn't pay what they owed. He wore an expensive suit that looked wrong on him, like putting silk on a pig, and his presence at this funeral was an intrusion, a violation of something sacred that everyone present could feel but nobody quite understood yet. He walked directly toward Catherine, ignoring the mourners who stepped aside to let him pass, their faces registering confusion and growing concern about why this particular man would be here at this particular moment. Marcus stopped directly in front of Catherine, close enough that she had to look up to see his face. She didn't know him, I could tell from her expression, but she recognized threat when she saw it. Every woman who reaches 73 has learned to read danger in a man's eyes, in his posture, in the way he invades personal space with deliberate intent. Marcus pulled a piece of paper from his jacket pocket, unfolded it slowly for dramatic effect, and held it in front of Catherine's face. He spoke loud enough that everyone nearby could hear, his voice carrying that particular edge of satisfaction that comes from inflicting pain on the helpless. He told Catherine that her late husband owed money, quite a bit of money actually, gambling debts that had accumulated over the past 2 years. The paper he held was supposedly documentation of these debts, $15,000 plus interest that had ballooned the total to nearly $22,000. He said the debt didn't die with Thomas, that it transferred to his estate, which meant Catherine now owed this money and would need to arrange payment immediately. The words hit Catherine like physical blows, each syllable draining more color from her already pale face. She stammered something about not knowing, about needing time, about how could this be true when Thomas had never mentioned any gambling, any debts, any trouble at all. Marcus smiled at her distress, actually smiled, like her pain was entertaining rather than heartbreaking. He told her he didn't care what she knew or didn't know, didn't care about her grief or her confusion. He wanted payment within 30 days, or he'd start seizing assets, her house, her car, whatever she had of value. He emphasized that he wasn't making a request but delivering terms that weren't negotiable. Then, and this is the part that changed everything, he reached out and pushed Catherine's shoulder, not hard enough to knock her down, but enough to make her stumble backward, enough to show complete disrespect in this sacred space on this terrible day. The rose fell from her hand, landing in the dirt beside Thomas's casket. Marcus told her she'd better start figuring out how to come up with his money unless she wanted to end up joining her husband sooner than planned. The threat was clear, delivered without subtlety or shame, while 50 witnesses watched in stunned silence. Then he turned and walked away, satisfied with the fear he'd planted, the power he'd asserted, the pain he'd inflicted on a grieving widow at her husband's funeral. He had no idea who Catherine Brennan really was, had no idea who her son was, had no idea that he'd just done something that would cost him everything he had, and things he didn't even know were at risk. The moment Marcus was gone, people rushed to Catherine's side. Her sister held her while she shook. Whether from shock or rage or simple overwhelm, I couldn't tell. Her nephew, a lawyer, immediately declared the debt documentation was probably fraudulent, that even if Thomas had owed money, the aggressive collection tactics Marcus had just employed were likely illegal. Someone retrieved the fallen rose and pressed it back into Catherine's hand. The priest, recovering from his own shock at what had just occurred, offered prayers and comfort while clearly struggling to process such brazen cruelty in consecrated ground. I stood at the edge of this commotion, watching and absorbing, already knowing that what I'd witnessed was just the beginning of something much larger. I'd grown up in this neighborhood, known the Brennans most of my life, and I knew things about their family that Marcus Webb clearly didn't. Catherine and Thomas had one child, a son named Daniel who'd left home at 18 and hadn't been back in 25 years. He sent money regularly, substantial amounts that had kept his parents comfortable in their retirement, but he never visited, never called on holidays, maintained only minimal contact through birthday cards and occasional letters. The neighborhood speculation about Daniel Brennan had generated various theories over the years, none of them close to the truth, all of them inadequate to explain why a son would stay away so completely from parents who'd loved him. But I knew I'd figured it out years ago through careful attention and deliberate silence about what I'd learned. Daniel Brennan had become Daniel Bianchi, had taken his mother's maiden name when he'd gone east, had built something in New York that his parents could never have been proud of, even as it made him wealthy and powerful beyond anything their steel mill wages could have imagined. He ran one of the most sophisticated organized crime operations on the eastern seaboard, not street-level thugs and protection rackets, but high-level operations involving international shipping, money laundering through legitimate businesses, political corruption that reached into state legislatures and federal agencies. He was careful, intelligent, insulated by layers of legitimate enterprise that made prosecution nearly impossible. He'd been investigated multiple times but never charged, his lawyers too good, and his operation too sophisticated for federal prosecutors to build cases that would hold up in court. And now his mother, the woman who'd raised him in a small house on Maple Street, who'd worked as a seamstress to help pay for his education, who'd cried when he left and never stopped hoping he'd come home. That woman had been pushed and threatened at her husband's funeral by a small-time thug who didn't have the sense to know he was touching something radioactive. I didn't approach Catherine at the cemetery. There was nothing I could offer that others weren't already providing: comfort, legal advice, promises to help her figure out whether Thomas really had gambling debts and what her options were. Instead, I went home and made a phone call I'd never expected to make, using a number I'd acquired years ago through connections I'd cultivated, specifically because I'd known someday information about Daniel Bianchi might be valuable. The phone rang 4 times before a man answered with a simple greeting that gave nothing away. I identified myself, explained where I was calling from, and said I had information about Catherine Brennan that Daniel needed to know immediately. There was a pause, then the man asked me to wait. 3 minutes passed. I counted them, watching the clock on my wall, before a different voice came on the line, deeper and more authoritative. This voice asked me who I was, how I'd gotten this number, and why I thought Daniel Bianchi would care about anything I had to say. I told him I'd witnessed something at Thomas Brennan's funeral that Daniel's mother was probably too proud to mention when she called him, but that Daniel needed to know about before things went any further. Another pause, longer this time. Then the voice told me to explain exactly what I'd seen, and I did, describing Marcus Webb's appearance, the debt he'd claimed, the way he'd pushed Catherine, the threats he'd made. When I finished, the line went completely silent for so long I thought the call had disconnected. Then the voice thanked me, told me never to use this number again, and hung up. For 3 days, nothing visible happened. Catherine was staying with her sister, too shaken to return to the house she'd shared with Thomas. The neighborhood rallied around her in the way small communities do, bringing food, offering help, expressing outrage at Marcus Webb's behavior. Catherine's nephew investigated the supposed gambling debt and found it was partially legitimate. Thomas had apparently gotten into some financial trouble about 18 months before his death, borrowing money from an illegal bookmaker to cover some bad bets. But the original debt had been $3,000, not $15,000, and the interest rates Marcus was charging were criminally usurious. The nephew started making calls to legal aid organizations and consumer protection agencies, building a strategy to fight the debt collection. Meanwhile, Marcus Webb continued his usual activities, apparently unconcerned about any consequences from his cemetery performance. He collected other debts, threatened other people, went about his business with the confidence of someone who'd never faced real retribution for his cruelty. He had no way of knowing that somewhere in New York machinery was already in motion, that his name had been flagged in systems he didn't know existed, that his continued freedom was now measured in days rather than years. I watched and waited, knowing something was coming, but not knowing what form it would take or when it would arrive. On the 4th day, after the funeral, Catherine received a visitor at her sister's house, a man in an expensive suit, carrying a briefcase, looking more like a corporate attorney than anything threatening. He introduced himself as a representative of the Brennan Family Trust, an entity Catherine had never heard of. He explained that her son Daniel had established this trust years ago to provide for his parents' needs and to protect family assets. The trust had just been informed of Thomas's death and Catherine's current difficulties, and had sent him to resolve certain outstanding matters. He opened his briefcase and produced documents. The original loan agreement between Thomas and the bookmaker, marked as paid in full with official documentation showing the debt had been satisfied completely. He also provided Catherine with a cashier's check for $50,000, identified as a death benefit from the trust that would help cover Thomas's funeral expenses and provide her with financial security. Additionally, he had papers transferring full ownership of the house on Maple Street into Catherine's name alone, with no mortgage or liens attached, and documents establishing a monthly income for Catherine that would ensure she never had to worry about money again. The man was professional and courteous, answering Catherine's questions about the trust and her son's involvement while carefully avoiding any details about Daniel's business or whereabouts. He stayed exactly 30 minutes, left his card in case Catherine had any follow-up questions, and departed as smoothly as he'd arrived, leaving Catherine stunned and her sister demanding to know what kind of trust Daniel had established that could distribute this kind of money so quickly. But that wasn't all that happened on the 4th day. While the trust representative was meeting with Catherine, Marcus Webb was going about his afternoon routine, hitting the gym, grabbing lunch at his usual spot, making collection calls to people who owed his boss money. He never made it home that evening. According to the police report I later read, Marcus was last seen leaving the gym around 2 in the afternoon, getting into his car in the parking lot. His car was found 3 days later in a long-term parking structure at the airport, wiped clean of fingerprints, nothing missing except Marcus himself. No witnesses reported seeing anything unusual. Security cameras in the parking garage had mysteriously malfunctioned during the relevant time period. Marcus's boss, the loan shark he worked for, reported him missing but provided minimal information to police, clearly wanting no official attention on his business operations. The police investigated half-heartedly. Marcus had an extensive criminal record, numerous enemies, and operated in circles where disappearances were occupational hazards. Without a body, without witnesses, without any evidence of foul play beyond the suspicious circumstances of his abandonment of his vehicle, the case went nowhere quickly. It was filed as a missing person, assigned a detective who had 50 other cases demanding attention, and essentially forgotten by everyone except Marcus's family and the people he'd victimized over the years, many of whom felt relieved rather than concerned about his disappearance. I knew what had happened to Marcus Webb, or at least I could make an educated guess that was probably 95% accurate. Daniel Bianchi had reached back from New York and plucked Marcus out of his life with the same casual efficiency that someone might swat a fly. There would be no trial, no due process, no opportunity for Marcus to explain or apologize or beg for mercy. He'd committed an unforgivable sin by touching Daniel's mother, and that sin carried a death sentence that was probably already executed by the time Catherine received her visit from the trust representative. Daniel had protected his mother's financial security and simultaneously removed the threat she'd faced, handling both matters with the same thorough professionalism that characterized his business operations. I imagined Marcus's final hours, the realization that he'd made a catastrophic mistake, the understanding of who Catherine Brennan's son really was, the terror of knowing that no amount of pleading or promising would change what was coming. I didn't feel sorry for him. He'd built a life on cruelty and intimidation, had chosen violence as his primary method of interaction with the world, and had finally encountered someone more powerful and more ruthless than himself. The universe had balanced an account that had been running a deficit for years. Catherine never learned the full truth about what happened to Marcus Webb, or why. About 2 weeks after Thomas's funeral, a different man in a suit visited her. This one, clearly law enforcement, a detective investigating Marcus's disappearance. He asked Catherine if she'd had any contact with Marcus after the funeral, whether she knew anything about his whereabouts, whether anyone had approached her claiming to represent her interests in dealing with Marcus. Catherine answered honestly. Yes, Marcus had appeared at her husband's funeral. Yes, he'd claimed Thomas owed money, but no, she hadn't seen or heard from him since. And yes, someone from a family trust had helped resolve the debt issue, but she had no idea who that person was beyond the business card he'd left. The detective seemed satisfied with her answers, perhaps sensing that Catherine genuinely knew nothing about Marcus's disappearance, perhaps simply recognizing that she was an elderly widow with no capacity to harm someone like Marcus, even if she'd wanted to. He thanked her for her time and left, and that was the last official inquiry Catherine received about the matter. Marcus Webb remained missing, his case grew cold, and eventually even his family stopped asking questions because the answers they might get would be worse than the uncertainty of not knowing. Life gradually returned to something resembling normal for Catherine Brennan. She moved back into her house on Maple Street, now fully owned without any mortgage, and settled into a routine that accommodated her grief while providing structure to her days. The trust sent monthly deposits that were generous enough to live comfortably without being so extravagant as to raise questions. She maintained her friendships, attended her church, volunteered at the library where she'd worked part-time for 15 years. The neighborhood gossip about Marcus Webb's disappearance eventually faded, replaced by other scandals and mysteries. Catherine never spoke publicly about the cemetery incident after those first few days, and people eventually stopped asking because she'd made clear through her silence that the matter was closed. But I noticed changes in her, a wariness that hadn't been there before, a careful attention to her surroundings that suggested someone had explained to her that she was protected, but also that protection came with certain responsibilities. She'd learned, I suspected, exactly who her son had become, and that knowledge had complicated her grief with other emotions I couldn't entirely read from my observer's distance. She'd raised a boy who'd grown into a man she couldn't be proud of, even as he protected her with a ruthlessness she'd never taught him. That contradiction lived in her eyes now, visible to anyone who looked carefully. I saw Daniel Bianchi once, about 3 months after his father's funeral. He came home for a day, just one day, traveling with security that hung back at careful distances, but was always visible to anyone paying attention. He spent the afternoon with his mother in the house on Maple Street, and I happened to walk past while he was there because I couldn't help myself, couldn't resist the curiosity about what he looked like in person, rather than in the occasional news photograph I'd found over the years. He was standing in the front yard with Catherine, both of them looking at Thomas's rose bushes that were dormant for winter. Catherine was talking, gesturing at the garden, and Daniel was listening with an attention that seemed genuine despite whatever other matters must have been demanding his focus. He looked different than I'd expected, more ordinary, less obviously dangerous, just a man in his early 50s with his mother's eyes and his father's build. There was nothing in his appearance that announced what he was or what he'd done. He could have been any son visiting his widowed mother, discussing gardening and house maintenance and family memories. But then Catherine reached up to touch his face in that gesture mothers make, and I saw his expression change into something harder, saw the mask of normalcy slip just enough to reveal the calculation underneath. He caught me watching from across the street, and our eyes met for perhaps 2 seconds. But in those 2 seconds, I understood that he knew exactly who I was, knew I'd made the phone call that had informed him about Marcus Webb, and was acknowledging that knowledge without any visible gesture. Then he looked away back to his mother, and the moment passed. Daniel left that evening, his security detail surrounding him as he got into a black SUV with tinted windows. I never saw him again after that day. Catherine continued her life on Maple Street, growing older but never remarrying, never leaving the house that held all her memories of Thomas and of the son she'd somehow managed to raise despite his ultimate trajectory. She lived another 12 years after Thomas's death, reaching 85 before a stroke took her peacefully in her sleep. Daniel came back for her funeral. I heard about it, but didn't attend because I'd moved away years earlier, pursuing work in another city. The funeral was large, well attended, and completely without incident. Catherine was buried next to Thomas in that same cemetery where Marcus Webb had made his fatal mistake, and if anyone present thought about that earlier funeral and its consequences, they kept those thoughts to themselves. Daniel stayed for the service and left immediately after, returning to whatever waited for him in New York, carrying the burden of being the son his mother had loved but couldn't be proud of, the protector who'd saved her through methods she'd never approved of if she'd been given a choice. I think about that October morning often, even now years later when I've built a life far from that neighborhood and those events. I think about Marcus Webb's casual cruelty, about how easy it was for him to hurt someone vulnerable, about how completely unaware he was that actions have consequences, even when those consequences aren't immediate or obvious. I think about Catherine Brennan standing at her husband's grave, absorbing threat and humiliation in what should have been a protected moment of grief, having no idea that her son would reach back from another life entirely to exact vengeance on her behalf. I think about Daniel Bianchi, who'd left home at 18 and built an empire on violence and corruption, but never stopped sending money to parents who didn't know where it came from, never stopped being the son who'd protect his mother, even if she'd be horrified by how that protection was delivered. The whole situation was a study in contradictions, illegal justice delivered efficiently, while legal justice would have been slow or non-existent, a criminal more effective at protecting his mother than the entire legal system that was supposed to serve that purpose. A woman kept safe through methods that violated everything she believed in, morally and spiritually. Marcus Webb's body was never found, his disappearance never solved, his fate sealed by a single act of cruelty that lasted less than 2 minutes, but had consequences that extended far beyond what any reasonable person could have anticipated. He went into that cemetery thinking he was powerful, thinking his physical strength and willingness to hurt people made him someone to be feared, thinking an elderly widow at her husband's funeral was a safe target for his intimidation tactics. He left that cemetery still thinking those things, still confident in his immunity from consequences, still oblivious to the fact that he'd just committed suicide in slow motion. Somewhere between the cemetery and his disappearance 3 days later, he must have learned the truth. I hope he had at least a few hours to understand what was happening, to recognize the magnitude of his mistake, to grasp that the universe he thought he understood had rules and hierarchies he'd been too stupid to learn. I hope that understanding terrified him, that he died knowing exactly why this was happening and accepting that there was no escape, no negotiation, no mercy available from forces he'd activated through his own casual cruelty. That's not forgiveness on my part. Marcus deserved what happened to him by any reasonable moral calculus. It's just that his death should have included comprehension, should have taught him the lesson he'd refused to learn throughout his entire violent life, even if that lesson came too late to change anything. The debt Marcus claimed Thomas owed was revealed to be partially legitimate but vastly inflated, exactly as Catherine's nephew had suspected. Thomas had gambled, had lost money he couldn't afford to lose, had borrowed from dangerous people to cover those losses. It was a secret shame he'd carried to his grave, never telling Catherine, never asking for help, trying to handle it himself and failing. By the time he died, he'd paid back most of the original loan, but the interest had accumulated beyond any reasonable calculation, and the loan shark Marcus worked for had seen Thomas's death as an opportunity to squeeze more money out of a grieving widow who wouldn't know what her husband had actually owed versus what they were claiming. It was a common enough scheme in that world: inflate debts, threaten vulnerable survivors, collect money that wasn't really owed. Marcus had done it dozens of times before with success, which is why he'd felt so confident approaching Catherine at the funeral. He'd calculated that she'd be too frightened and too uninformed to fight back, that he could collect payment quickly and move on to the next victim. What he hadn't calculated was that some victims have protectors, that some families have resources beyond what's visible on the surface, that some elderly widows have sons who'll burn the world down to keep them safe, even if those sons have been absent for decades. I learned later, through channels I'd cultivated over years of careful networking, that Daniel Bianchi never returned home again after his mother's funeral. He continued his operations in New York, continued building his empire, continued living the life he'd chosen at 18 when he'd left his parents behind. But he maintained the trust he'd established, ensuring that money continued flowing to support Catherine's church, the library where she'd volunteered, the neighborhood programs she'd cared about. It was legacy management, I suppose, making sure his mother's memory was honored, even if he couldn't honor it personally, using illegal money to do good works that might somehow balance the karmic debt he'd accumulated through decades of criminal enterprise. Whether that actually accomplished anything meaningful or just made Daniel feel better about his choices, I couldn't say. The world is complicated, morality is contextual, and people are capable of holding contradictory truths simultaneously. Daniel was a criminal and a son, a murderer and a protector, a man who ruined lives through his business operations while also ensuring his mother never had to worry about money in her final years. Marcus Webb was a violent enforcer and also someone's son, someone who probably had people who loved him despite his cruelty, someone whose disappearance left gaps in lives beyond just the criminal organization he'd worked for. The priest who'd conducted Thomas's funeral service died 5 years later, and at his service someone mentioned the incident with Marcus Webb, not by name, but as a story about desecration of sacred space and how shocked the priest had been by such brazen cruelty. The story had become part of church community law, passed down as a cautionary tale about respecting grieving families and honoring the dead. No one mentioned Marcus's subsequent disappearance when they told the story, either because they'd never connected the two events or because they'd connected them all too well and chose silence over speculation. The cemetery itself became a place I avoided whenever I visited that town, which grew increasingly rare as years passed and my connections to that community faded. I didn't want to walk past Thomas and Catherine's graves and remember that October morning, didn't want to think about everything that had spiraled out from those few minutes of cruelty. Some memories are better left undisturbed, some questions better left unasked, some truths better left in whatever graves, literal or metaphorical, they've been buried in. But I carry the memory regardless, stored in that part of my mind where significant moments live regardless of whether we want them there. I remember Catherine's face as Marcus pushed her shoulder, the way she stumbled backward, the rose falling from her hand. I remember the satisfied smirk on Marcus's face as he delivered his threats, completely unaware that he'd just destroyed his own life through casual cruelty. I remember making that phone call, setting consequences in motion, becoming part of the machinery that would eventually erase Marcus Webb from the world as thoroughly as if he'd never existed. I don't feel guilty about that call. Marcus had sealed his own fate long before I got involved, but I carry the weight of it nonetheless, the knowledge that I'd enabled something dark, even if it was also something that protected someone vulnerable. The world is full of such moral compromises, such complicated choices, where every option carries costs and where clarity is a luxury nobody actually gets to have. We do what seems right in the moment with the information available, and then we live with the consequences of those choices, and sometimes decades later we're still trying to figure out whether we made the right decision or just the one we could live with at the time. Catherine Brennan never knew, as far as I could tell, that I'd been the one who informed Daniel about Marcus's appearance at the funeral. If she did know, she never acknowledged it, never thanked me or questioned me or indicated any awareness of my role in the events that followed. That was probably for the best. Some debts are too complicated to acknowledge, some favors too dark to thank someone for, some truths too heavy to speak aloud even when everyone involved understands exactly what happened and why. She lived out her remaining years in peace, protected by her absent son, secure in the house she'd shared with her husband, insulated from the ugly realities that had briefly intruded into her life. Whether she ever fully understood what Daniel had done on her behalf, whether she approved or was horrified, or felt some mixture of both. I never learned. She kept those feelings private, locked behind the dignity and grace that had characterized her entire life, and took whatever knowledge she'd gained to her grave, alongside her grief for Thomas and her complicated love for the son who'd become someone she couldn't have imagined when she'd held him as a baby and dreamed about his future. About 7 years after Catherine's death, I received an unexpected phone call that brought everything full circle in ways I hadn't anticipated. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, professional, identifying itself as belonging to an attorney representing the estate of Daniel Bianchi. My first thought was that Daniel had died, but the attorney quickly clarified that Daniel was very much alive, but had decided to settle certain outstanding matters from his past. I was listed as a beneficiary in a private trust Daniel had established years ago, the attorney explained, and there were documents I needed to review and sign. The whole thing felt surreal. I hadn't had any contact with Daniel or anyone connected to him since that brief moment of eye contact in Catherine's front yard 7 years earlier. I'd moved on with my life, built a career in another city, gotten married, had children, deliberately distanced myself from that neighborhood and those memories. Yet somehow, Daniel had kept track of me, had known where I was, had decided I deserved something from him, though I couldn't imagine what or why. The attorney wouldn't discuss details over the phone, insisting I needed to come to his office in person to review the materials and understand the full scope of what Daniel had arranged. Against my better judgment, driven by curiosity that overrode caution, I agreed to make the trip. The attorney's office was in a nondescript building in downtown Philadelphia, the kind of place that handled estates and trusts for wealthy clients who valued discretion over flashy displays. The attorney himself was probably in his 60s, silver-haired and impeccably dressed, with the careful manner of someone who'd spent decades protecting client confidentiality and navigating legal grey areas. He showed me into a conference room where a thick manila folder waited on the polished table, my name written on it in neat block letters. Before opening it, the attorney explained the situation with a directness I appreciated. Daniel Bianchi had established several trusts over the years to address what he called moral debts, obligations he felt he owed to people who'd helped him or his family in ways that couldn't be repaid through normal channels. I was one of perhaps a dozen people who'd been identified as beneficiaries of these trusts. The phone call I'd made years ago, informing Daniel about Marcus Webb's behavior at his father's funeral, had been noted and valued far more than I'd realized at the time. Daniel viewed that call as an act of loyalty to his mother, protection provided when she'd needed it most, and he wanted to acknowledge that service even though years had passed and circumstances had changed dramatically for everyone involved. Inside the folder were documents establishing a trust in my name containing $250,000, invested conservatively to generate income while preserving principal. The trust had been funded 5 years earlier, the attorney explained, but Daniel had instructed that I not be informed until after Catherine's death. He hadn't wanted anything to complicate her final years or raise questions she shouldn't have to answer. The money came with no strings attached, no obligations, no expectations of future service or loyalty. It was simply Daniel's way of saying, "Thank you for that single phone call, for caring enough about his mother to reach out when she was threatened, for doing what he couldn't do from a distance." The amount was staggering to me, far more than seemed justified by one phone call, far more than I would have ever expected or asked for. The attorney watched my reaction with the practiced neutrality of someone who'd delivered this kind of news before and knew it took time to process. He explained that the trust was structured to be completely legal, the funds laundered through so many legitimate businesses and investments that no connection to Daniel's criminal enterprises could be traced. I could accept the money without any legal or moral jeopardy beyond the philosophical question of whether taking money from a criminal was itself wrong. I sat there staring at the documents, trying to figure out how I felt about this unexpected windfall from a man I'd barely met, earned through a phone call I'd made out of basic decency rather than any expectation of reward. The practical part of my mind immediately calculated what this money could mean: college funds for my children, paying off the mortgage, financial security that would change my family's trajectory. The moral part struggled with accepting money that ultimately came from criminal activity, from an organization that had hurt people and broken laws and operated outside the systems I'd been raised to respect. The attorney seemed to sense my conflict because he leaned forward and spoke with unexpected candidness. He told me he'd been Daniel's attorney for 20 years, had handled dozens of these trusts, had seen how Daniel tried to balance the scales in his own complicated way. Daniel knew what he was, knew what he'd done, and didn't pretend his wealth was clean or his legacy was honorable, but he also tried in his limited capacity to do right by people who'd shown kindness or loyalty to his family. The trust was Daniel's attempt at redemption, or at least recognition that some debts couldn't be left unpaid even if payment came from tainted sources. Whether I accepted the money was entirely my decision, the attorney said, but he wanted me to understand that refusing it wouldn't make the money cleaner or Daniel's sins lighter. It would just mean that Daniel's attempt to acknowledge my help went rejected. I took 3 days to think about it, discussing the situation with my wife, who had her own strong opinions about accepting money from organized crime figures. We debated the ethics extensively, considering whether the money's origins tainted it permanently, or whether money was morally neutral, and only the uses it was put to mattered. We thought about our children's futures, about the opportunities this trust could provide, about the financial stress it could eliminate from our lives. We also thought about what accepting it would mean symbolically, whether it made us complicit in some way with Daniel's crimes, whether we could live with ourselves knowing our security came from such a dark source. In the end, we decided to accept the trust, but to use a significant portion of it for charitable purposes, establishing scholarships for kids from our old neighborhood, donating to organizations that helped victims of violent crime, trying to transform tainted money into something that might do genuine good in the world. It was a compromise that let us take advantage of Daniel's gift while also addressing our moral concerns about its origins. I signed the documents, took control of the trust, and began the process of figuring out how to manage this unexpected wealth in ways that honored Catherine's memory rather than Daniel's methods. Over the following years, I learned that I wasn't the only person Daniel had tried to compensate for past kindnesses or perceived debts. The attorney let slip, in carefully vague terms, that similar trusts had been established for Beth, the waitress from Sal's diner, for several of Catherine's neighbors who'd helped her after Thomas died, for the priest who'd conducted the funeral service, even for Catherine's nephew who'd investigated Marcus Webb's debt claims and tried to protect his aunt from exploitation. Daniel had been watching from a distance all those years, taking note of who'd shown his mother kindness or respect, who'd stood up for her when she was vulnerable, who'd treated her with the dignity she deserved. Each of those people received trusts of varying amounts based on what Daniel perceived as the significance of their actions. It was strange to think of this criminal overlord maintaining such detailed awareness of his mother's life from hundreds of miles away, tracking the small kindnesses that made up her daily existence, deciding years later how to reward people who'd probably forgotten the specific interactions that had caught his attention. The whole system revealed something about Daniel that was hard to reconcile with his reputation, a capacity for gratitude, a desire to acknowledge goodness, even if he couldn't embody it himself, a son's enduring love for a mother, he disappointed in almost every way except his determination to protect and provide for her. I met one of the other beneficiaries by chance about 2 years after accepting my trust. I'd returned to the old neighborhood for a high school reunion and ended up at a bar with some former classmates. One of them mentioned that Beth from Sal's Diner had moved to Florida, bought a small cafe there, and seemed to be doing well for herself. Someone else added that she'd apparently received some inheritance from a distant relative that had given her the capital to make the move and start the business. I recognized the story for what it was, the cover story people told when unexpected wealth entered their lives from sources they couldn't or wouldn't explain. Beth had received her trust, had made her own decision about accepting it, and had used it to build something new away from the town where she'd witnessed too much ugliness. I wondered if she thought about that October morning at the cemetery as often as I did, whether she carried the same complicated feelings about what had followed, whether she'd reached her own peace with accepting Daniel's money and what it represented. I never reached out to her to compare notes or share experiences because some things are better left unspoken, some connections better left unmade. We were bonded by shared witness to violence and its consequences, but that didn't mean we needed to be friends or even acknowledge that bond existed. The neighborhood itself changed gradually over the years following Catherine's death. Property values rose as younger families moved in, attracted by good schools and affordable housing. The old factory where Thomas had worked for 42 years was converted into luxury lofts, transforming industrial space into trendy residential units that bore no trace of the blue-collar history they'd displaced. Sal's Diner closed when Sal himself retired, the building purchased by a developer who turned it into a craft beer bar that bore no resemblance to the modest breakfast spot where so many significant moments had occurred. The cemetery remained largely unchanged, though better maintained now as the neighborhood's increased wealth translated into higher maintenance budgets for public spaces. Thomas and Catherine's graves were marked by a simple shared headstone, their names and dates etched in grey granite. No mention of their son or the complicated legacy he'd built far from their modest life. I visited those graves once, about 5 years ago, standing there trying to imagine what Catherine would think about everything that had happened, the violence done on her behalf, the money distributed in her memory, the lives changed because of a single cruel act at her husband's funeral. I didn't come to any conclusions that day, didn't gain any special insight or find any closure. I just stood there acknowledging that these two ordinary people had somehow been at the center of extraordinary events and that their story would die with the handful of people who knew the truth. Daniel Bianchi himself became something of a ghost in my awareness over the years. I'd occasionally see news articles about organized crime prosecutions on the eastern seaboard and wonder if his name would appear, if federal authorities would finally build a case strong enough to bring him down. It never happened during the years I paid attention. He remained free, insulated by his careful operations and excellent lawyers, apparently untouchable despite multiple investigations and grand juries. I wondered sometimes if the trusts he'd established were part of some larger strategy to protect himself, creating beneficiaries who'd be unlikely to cooperate with federal prosecutors if called as witnesses, ensuring that people who knew pieces of his story had incentive to maintain silence. If that was his calculation, it was probably accurate. I certainly had no interest in testifying against someone who'd given my family financial security, regardless of how I felt about his criminal activities. The trust had made me complicit in a way that mere witness to events wouldn't have, binding me to Daniel through financial obligation, even though he'd asked nothing in return. Maybe that was the point. Or maybe I was overthinking it, and Daniel genuinely just wanted to say thank you to people who'd helped his mother. Either way, I kept my silence about everything I knew, and the money continued generating income that helped my children through college and into their adult lives. Marcus Webb's family never found closure about his disappearance. I followed the case loosely through news reports and occasional conversations with people who'd stayed in the neighborhood. His mother gave interviews to local media on the anniversary of his disappearance each year for the first 5 years, begging for information, insisting that despite his problems, Marcus hadn't deserved to simply vanish without anyone being held accountable. She was right, of course, in the abstract sense that everyone deserves due process and legal justice. But the specific context, what Marcus had done, who he'd done it to, the machinery he'd activated through his casual cruelty, made it hard to muster much sympathy for his situation. His mother's grief was real and valid, but so was Catherine Brennan's grief, and so was the terror Catherine had felt when Marcus threatened her at her husband's grave. The universe had delivered its own form of justice, bypassing legal systems that would have been slow or ineffective, and while I couldn't celebrate that outcome, I also couldn't mourn it. Marcus had lived by violence and intimidation, and he'd died by those same forces when he'd encountered someone more powerful than himself. It was tragic in the Greek sense, inevitable consequences flowing from character flaws and bad decisions, but it wasn't unjust. I think about legacy often now that I'm older, thinking about what we leave behind when we're gone and how we're remembered by the people whose lives we've touched. Thomas Brennan left behind a widow who'd loved him despite his flaws, a son who'd avenged him even though they'd been estranged, and a community that remembered him as a decent man who'd worked hard and treated people fairly. Catherine left behind a similar legacy of kindness and dignity, though hers was complicated by her connection to Daniel and the violence that had swirled around her final years. Daniel will leave behind an empire that will probably collapse when he dies or goes to prison. Criminal enterprises that will be carved up by rivals or shut down by federal authorities, and a reputation as someone dangerous and ruthless who nonetheless maintained certain principles about family and loyalty. Marcus Webb left behind victims who were relieved by his disappearance, a family that grieved him despite his cruelty, and an object lesson about the consequences of underestimating people based on age or apparent vulnerability. Each of these legacies says something about how we move through the world, the choices we make, the marks we leave on other people's lives. I wonder what my own legacy will be: witness to violence, beneficiary of criminal generosity, someone who tried to thread moral needles and live with complicated decisions. I don't know yet how that story ends or what judgment future generations might render if they knew the full truth. The trust fund Daniel established for me will pass to my children when I die, transformed through investment growth and careful management into an even larger inheritance than what I received. My children know the money exists, but not where it came from. I've told them it was an inheritance from a distant relative, the same vague cover story that probably everyone else has used to explain their trusts. Maybe someday I'll tell them the truth, give them the full story of that October morning in the cemetery and everything that followed. Or maybe I'll let them live in ignorance, spare them the moral complexity of knowing their education and opportunities were funded by organized crime money, even if that money was given freely with no strings attached. There's an argument for radical honesty, for ensuring the next generation understands the full context of their advantages and privileges. There's also an argument for protection, for shielding children from knowledge that might burden them unnecessarily or change how they see their father. I haven't decided which approach is right, and maybe that decision will be made for me by circumstances I can't predict. For now, the money sits in accounts and investments, generating returns that fund ordinary life expenses and extraordinary opportunities. Its origins a secret I carry, like all the other secrets from that time. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't made that phone call, if I'd simply been another witness who watched Marcus threaten Catherine and then went home without getting involved. Would Daniel have learned about the cemetery incident anyway through other channels? Or would Marcus have continued threatening Catherine until she'd paid money she didn't owe out of fear and ignorance? Would the FBI have eventually brought Daniel down on other charges, eliminating his ability to protect his mother from a distance? Would Catherine's final years have been spent in poverty and fear rather than security and peace? The counterfactuals multiply endlessly, each one suggesting different outcomes based on small changes in choices and timing. But the reality is what happened. I made the call, Daniel acted, Marcus disappeared, Catherine lived her remaining years in comfort. And I received compensation that changed my family's trajectory. Those are the facts I live with, and whatever alternative histories might have existed are just speculation about roads not taken and choices not made. We live in the world we created through our decisions, and that world is complicated and messy and rarely offers clear moral certainties about whether we did the right thing or just the thing we could live with. The last time I thought seriously about all of this was about 6 months ago when I attended the funeral of one of my former neighbors from that old street where the Brennans had lived. It was held at the same cemetery just a few rows over from where Thomas and Catherine were buried. During the service, my eyes drifted to their gravesite, and I found myself mentally replaying that October morning. Marcus appearing uninvited, Catherine stumbling backward as he pushed her shoulder, the rose falling from her hand, the witnesses standing frozen in shock and shame at their own inaction. I thought about how that single moment had rippled outward, touching dozens of lives, ending at least one life, redirecting futures and fortunes in ways none of us could have predicted. And I thought about justice, what it means, how it's delivered, whether it always requires courts and laws or whether sometimes it operates through other channels that are faster and harsher, but perhaps more effective. I didn't reach any grand conclusions that day any more than I had at previous moments of reflection. I just acknowledged again that life is complicated, that people are capable of both great kindness and terrible cruelty, that violence begets violence until someone decides to break the cycle or redirect it, and that we're all connected in ways we don't fully understand until something forces us to pay attention to those connections and their consequences.